I'm Sarah Wilson and you're listening to the Roots and All podcast. I'm here to help you get growing. Join me as I explore everything plant related both indoors and out and provide the information you need to create your perfect green environment. Hello and welcome to this episode of the podcast. I hope you're all staying safe and well and that you're coping okay. To be honest, I've been struggling a bit for the past week and I've been taking a break from social media. I've been sticking my headphones in, queuing up my favourite podcasts, and I've been going outdoors and losing myself in the garden, which is why I decided to record this intro outside. So I'm hoping you can catch a bit of the birdsong in the background. So this episode, I'm carrying on in the spirit of supporting independent nurseries, and I'd like to give a shout out to Ivy Hatch Plant Supplies, who are continuing to deliver plants to customers. As a little bit of background on the nursery, they're a family-run business which started 20 years ago growing herbs and alpines. They then met Tom Hart-Dyke, who'd just opened the World Garden at Lullingstone Castle. They started supplying his nursery there with stock geared to reflect the really unusual plantings in those gardens. And then they crossed over to mail order a few years ago to keep the sales going through the winter. And it's really taken off. This year they've bred and launched a brand new salvia which has been featured in the 2020 RHS Plant Finder. And they are noted for their salvias. Ivy Hatch Plants aims to supply rarely offered plants at accessible prices. And Debs, who runs the nursery, says, "I want everyone to be able to get hold of them. I know what it's like to have a plant unicorn and love being able to say yes to people who have been hunting for ages for a particular variety. So do go and bag yourself a rare beauty and support a really hard-working nursery at www.ivyhatchplantsupplies.co.uk. So on to the episode, and this week I'm speaking to Tomos Jones. Tomos is a PhD student at the University of Reading, where he's currently researching invasive plants. There are 17,000 plant species from all over the world currently residing in our gardens here in the UK. A small percentage of these manage to jump the garden fence and survive in the wild, and a smaller percentage still become a problem. But although it's a small percentage that become invasive, anyone who's done battle with Japanese knotweed knows that they can be a huge problem. Tomos is working to predict which plants may become a problem in the future, using a range of forecasting techniques, coupled with help from gardeners. In order to tell the harmless plants from the troublemakers, Tomos first needed to address the slightly thorny issue of which plants are native to the British Isles. Could you start by defining what is a native plant and what is a non-native?
Yeah, so simply, a native species is one which has arrived in the British Isles naturally, and by that I mean hasn't been introduced by humans. So by that definition, it's not necessarily an issue of time, and by extension, a new species, a new native species could arrive tomorrow, as wind-borne seed from the continent perhaps be regarded as a new native species. A non-native species, a non-native plant, is one that has been introduced to the British Isles by the humans, either intentionally as an ornamental plant or perhaps unintentionally. So that's a simple defining factor there. So some non-native plants have been here for centuries, and there are notable examples. Some of these people might be surprised to learn that they are in fact non-native. So one example we can look at is the sycamore, Hirsutio platanus, which could have been introduced by the Romans perhaps a bit later in the 1500s. And that's a non-native species by that definition. Another good example is the snowdrop, Galanthus nivalis. For most people is a valued part of the British flora, but again, in fact, is non-native, having been introduced in 1597. So these have been here for centuries, but are regarded as non-native. And the important distinction, perhaps, or an important fact to consider, is that non-native species are not defined as having a detrimental ecological impact. Those are slightly different. Those we term invasive, and perhaps I can focus on those later on. But the simple distinction there is the mode of introduction having been introduced by humans.
And actually that takes me on to my next question, which is how many new species of plants are we introduced to the UK each year? And of those, how many actually jump the garden fence and become established in the wild?
Okay, the numbers are staggering. Obviously, Britain is famous for plant exploration, has been for centuries, which is why we've got non-native plants for such a long period. And now, today, perhaps almost half of the British flora is composed of non-native species. And the majority of those were introduced originally as ornamental plants, so introduced for horticulture. But if we look at a few numbers, so the Royal Horticulture Society published their plant finder annually, and this is essentially a list of plants available in nurseries in the British Isles. Now, that plant finder contains 78,000 entries. That huge number includes many different cultivars and varieties. If we look at species level, there's 17,000 species, so a huge number. The vast majority of those are still confined to gardens and very popular ornamental plants. But on this subject, there's a very good book called Alien Plants by Clive Stace and Mick Crawley. And there we've got about 1,000 ornamental plants that have escaped the garden fence, if you want, and they're naturalised in the wild. We can look at naturalised species, and by naturalised, I mean plants that have escaped into the wild and they spread, so they've got a self-reproducing population. So we've got about 1,000 ornamental plants growing in the wild that you can find on any sort of Sunday walk in the wild in the British Isles. Other species have escaped gardens, but they don't necessarily survive. So they don't necessarily have a self-reproducing population. That could be perhaps they don't survive minimum winter temperatures. So you only find them in the wild because of repeated escapes from gardens. Some of those could be summer bedding, for example. So French and African marigolds are a good example. I haven't looked at these two species during my PhD, but I remember planting these with my granddad as a child. Popular bedding, summer bedding, but you only find them in the wild because of repeated reintroductions or escapes.
Of the ones that are able to reproduce of their own accord, would you class all of those as invasives?
No, a very small number of those. And that's perhaps the main point when we're distinguishing between non-native and invasive. So I said there were approximately 1,000 naturalised ornamental plants in the wild. It's a relatively small number of those that have become invasive. I would say the numbers differ depending on your source, but if we look back at the Alien Plants book, approximately 60 species are regarded as true invasives. So it's a relatively small number. Now, invasive species are one of the main threats to biodiversity, both globally and the British Isles. So although it's a relatively small number, it's by no means a small problem. But the emphasis is that although we have perhaps 78,000 different plants growing in our gardens, it's a very small proportion that are invasive. And by invasive, I mean having a detrimental ecological impact or economic impact. So having that noticeable impact on native biodiversity.
Right. So just because a plant isn't classed as invasive, could it still cause problems by occupying a niche that would otherwise be taken up by a native plant?
Arguably, yes. Of course, any non-native plant is filling a niche or a space that would otherwise be occupied by a native species. I think it's difficult to argue against that point. But here I would perhaps argue for a degree of pragmatism, only because of the vast number of non-native ornamental plants we already have. So perhaps we need to focus our attention on those species that have a noticeable detrimental impact on native biodiversity, because many of the non-invasive ornamental species do provide ecosystem services. We might get back to this later. So many of them might have positive impacts. It's not all about negative impacts when we're looking at the invasive species. So I would argue for a degree of pragmatism, especially in the context of limited resources for conservation efforts and so on.
Mm-hmm. I think we probably all know about things like Japanese knotweed, but of giving a broad overview of the 60 invasive plants that you're concerned with, what kind of things are they doing that is causing such trouble? So
an invasive ornamental plant might compete against a native plant for resources. We could look at light, for example. One invasive species that I've been looking at is giant rhubarb, Gunnera species, either Gunnera tinctoria, Gunnera manicata from South America. As the common name suggests, giant rhubarb, these are huge rhubarb-looking plants, very popular ornamental plants if you've got a big enough garden for them. often planted along the edge of a pond or a stream. If they've got the correct conditions, they're invasive in parts of Ireland, for example. If they have the correct conditions, you can essentially have a forest of this plant, and the leaves can grow up to 2 meters in diameter. So underneath, you've got very little light for the plants. That's one factor. Obviously, invasive species can change the biochemistry of the soil also. Pests and diseases is a very important point, but that's separate to my PhD. So they can have a negative impact in very different ways. And it can sometimes be difficult to measure the extent of that impact.
I thought it was interesting what you said about the non-native plants who aren't invasive actually providing a benefit occasionally, sometimes. Is that they provide a benefit just in terms of providing nectar and pollen, or can they also be useful as a host species to certain wildlife species?
Yes, so the RHS have done some work on this as part of their Plants for Bugs project, where they were comparing ornamental species with native species, plant species, and their importance for insects and invertebrates. So, of course, ornamental plants can provide additional habitats, for example. You mentioned they can provide resources for pollinators also. Such factors might be very important in the context of climate change. So if you're looking at changing phenology, for example, ornamental plants as a resource for pollinators could become more important. Perhaps the conclusion for the RHS project was that insects and invertebrates might prefer native species, but ornamental plants have a role in providing habitats and additional resources. Again, if we're looking at pollinators, having a mix in your garden of native and non-native plants, it does extend the flowering season, for example. So the conclusion would be perhaps native species are better for insects, invertebrates, and so on, but there's no harm in having those additional resources provided by ornamental plants. So I would argue for a nice mix in the garden of native and non-native plants.
Yeah, obviously that was just looking at the garden. I guess I'm thinking more about things that have naturalised in the wild environment. Yeah. I think maybe that RHS study, I did have some issues with it. I thought it was slightly disingenuous because they did, I think, downplay the importance of the native plants in the conclusions that they put out in the press, because they did actually say that it was, it was proven that the native plants were preferable, but they did only look at pollinators. They didn't look at the plants as host species for biodiversity. So again, I think in a garden setting, yes, it's great to have a mixture. In the wild, perhaps, I don't think that you could argue that, I don't think you can conclusively argue that the non-natives that have naturalised are doing as good a job because they didn't look at them as food plants, and that was a bit of an issue with that.
I totally agree. In the wild, of course, native species are better than non-native species, because in terms of interactions between pollinators or invertebrates and plants, these interactions are the result of a huge amount of time. And although at the very beginning I mentioned that some of these naturalized plants have been here for centuries, that's such a short time span when we're looking at the whole ecological process or ecological system in the wild. So when we're looking at naturalized ornamental plants in the wild, my focus would be on measuring to what extent they've got a negative impact rather than on what extent they've got a positive impact, so that we can distinguish between the two invasive species, and then perhaps we can categorize naturalized non-native ornamentals as benign, perhaps, not having a noticeable negative impact, and there's still work to be done on what extent they have a positive impact.
Yeah, so excuse my ignorance with anything to do with science, but I'm guessing that part of your work would be to take a patch that was purely natives and then some that were naturalised plants and then some invasives and compare those? Yes,
that would be one approach. Sadly, I don't work in the field. I'm behind the beautiful computer. But one way of measuring the impact or the comparable impact of native and non-native species for biodiversity would be, yes, a field experiment where you've got a purely non-native plot, and then I would argue also to have a mixture, because in the wild they are not separated. They do interact, and for the most part perhaps coexist. So it would also be interesting to measure their relative performance as a mixed stand of native and non-native plants.
So thinking about it in terms of the garden again,
yeah.
Obviously you said that there's 78,000 species that we have in this country now, according to the RHS. I don't see that slowing down anytime soon. We seem to have quite an obsession for the new and the novel when we look at plants. But do you think that there should be tighter controls on the importation of plants into the UK because we just don't know what we're bringing in?
It's a very difficult question to answer. Legislation certainly has an important role, and it's an important mechanism in terms of controlling plant introductions. So for us in the UK, if we're looking at invasive species that have been introduced, these fall under Schedule 9 of the Wildlife and Countries Act, but also the EU regulation on invasive alien species. And I cannot say how that legislation will develop given the political context we're in. But legal mechanisms such as those are important in banning species that we know are invasive. My particular interest here, and it has the same goal as tighter controls on importation, is public awareness of the problem. Perhaps it's a softer approach, but has the same goal of controlling potentially invasive species, and that's raising public awareness of the impact they can have. And for invasive plants, of course, gardeners are crucial in that.
Yes, it definitely would be a great thing for people to understand about the plants they're bringing in and to take responsibility, because, as you say, it's difficult to legislate. It's better if everybody could take responsibility for it. So, yeah, I think that's a great way of looking at it.
Legislation is obviously important, and the legislation is updated in terms of the plants that fall under the legislation. But as I said, my particular interest is in raising public awareness, and that was the main reason for the University of Reading exhibiting at the RHS Chelsea Flower Show last year, was raising awareness of the problem of invasive species among gardeners. And it went down very well. As a topic, gardeners were very interested in the topic and their role as gardeners in reducing the risk associated with invasive species.
What was the garden that you had at Chelsea last year?
So at Chelsea we had an exhibit called Ornamental Plants, Our Future Invaders, which is essentially a summary of my PhD, and this formed part of my PhD project. And this is in the Discovery Zone of the RHS Chelsea Flower Show. The Discovery Zone is where visitors can engage and learn about horticultural research. So for this we were awarded a gold medal, and the main element of the exhibit was a wooden fabrication of a plant called giant rhubarb, the Gunnera tinctoria, which is invasive in parts of Ireland, as I said. Now, in the shadow of this wooden structure, I planted a selection of popular ornamental plants. Some of these were invasive, others not. And this combination of invasive and non-invasive ornamental plants helped me explain the invasion process, how ornamental plants escape gardens and grow in the wild. And to help me explain, we had beautiful interpretation material, including leaflets and interpretation boards. These were designed by undergraduate students at the Department of Typography and Graphic Communication at the University of Reading. We distributed 2,500 leaflets and probably engaged with 7,500 to 10,000 visitors during Chelsea Week. And there was a huge amount of interest in the issue of invasive plants and the role of gardeners in that issue, not only in responsible gardening, but also the choice of plants and so on.
So which ornamental plants have the potential to be invasive, I guess now and under future climate scenarios that you might particularly like to highlight to listeners?
A beautiful question, and that's the main challenge of my PhD. So that's what I'm looking at the moment. And of course, it's not just me looking at this. To measure invasive potential is very difficult. because there are so many factors involved. At the stage I'm at the moment, I've been engaging with gardeners across the British Isles, and over 800 gardeners have completed the survey for me, which had the very simple questions. The question was, what is the main ornamental plant that you've noticed invading or taking over your garden? So very quickly, the premise for that was, if a gardener observes a plant showing invasive behavior, if you wish, and that plant escapes and shows the same behavior in the wild, then it could potentially be classed as an invasive species having a detrimental impact. So that survey gave me a list of ornamental plants of interest for me to look at further and to look at whether they've got invasive potential. There are two ways I'm currently looking at trying to measure invasive potential and thus have a short list, if you wish, of plants that we need to look at. One is a method called species distribution modelling. And this quite simply finds a relationship between where the plant grows currently, both in the British Isles, but I could look globally. So finding a relationship between where the plant is growing and the current climate. And by using that relationship, then the method can project into the future, depending on different climate scenarios. It can project areas, geographic areas that might be suitable for that plant to grow in the future. So if we're looking at a known invasive plant, perhaps Japanese knotweed, for example, by using that method, you can map which parts of the British Isles might become more or less suitable for the plant in the future. So that's one method of trying to understand invasive potential. But on its own, it has limitations. So another approach also is an approach called trait-based. And this trait-based approach essentially tries to identify characteristics or traits of a plant that make that plant more likely to be invasive. And it can be a combination of traits. And there's a lot of research being done using this approach. But theoretically, if you can identify a combination of traits that increase the invasive potential of a plant, you could then combine that method with the species distribution modelling to try and measure that invasive potential from different perspectives. But as I said, it's a very, very, very difficult question to answer, and it's becoming a very, very dynamic and busy field of research globally, measuring invasive potential.
Could you also, I think obviously we spoke before and your work is ongoing,
yeah.
But from that you can potentially tell which plants might become a problem in the future as well. So have you got any conclusions about that, or is that still part of the ongoing research?
So at the moment, I've got the list of plants from the survey I mentioned. So that's a survey where 800 gardeners have given me plants that they deem problematic in their gardens. There's probably 150 ornamental plants that have been reported in that survey, and I can give you the top three, which I'm looking at. I'm looking at the full list, of course. But the top three are very interesting when we're looking at invasive potential. So the most commonly reported is Japanese anemone hybrida, followed by lady's mantle, Alchemilla mollis, and then the third most commonly reported plant is Montbretia, Crocosmiflora. Now, due to pure luck, these sequence, or the top three, are very interesting when we're looking at how ornamental plants escape and potentially become invasive. So if I can explain, Japanese anemone is not naturalized, or at least not widely naturalized, and I don't know of it self-reproducing in the wild. So that Japanese anemone is an example of a plant that has not naturalized of ornamental origin. Lady's mantle, on the other hand, has naturalized, and you find it in the wild in the British Isles. So that's an example of a plant that has escaped the garden fence, if you will, and it self-reproduces in the wild. The third example, then, Montbretia, is regarded as an invasive species. Not necessarily throughout the British Isles, but I come from North Wales. It's certainly problematic as an invasive species in hedgerows and so on. In North Wales, it loves the conditions up there. So that's an invasive species that originally escaped the garden, naturalized, and then had a detrimental ecological impact. So those top 3 plants from the survey illustrate quite nicely the process of plants escaping. So those are sort of plants I'm looking at further using those 2 methods I mentioned, the species distribution modeling and the trait-based approach. So hopefully having a short list essentially of ornamental plants of high risk in the future.
Actually, 3 things struck me when you were talking there. The first one, I suppose, is it's a 2-parter. Is it more likely that a plant is likely to establish in the wild if it has a near relative already in the landscape? And if it does, is that plant more likely to fit into an ecosystem in a positive way because it's similar to a plant that's already native to the British Isles?
That question I'm not too sure about, because if it has a near native, if you wish, depending on how closely they're related, then of course that plant might be more suited to climate, for example, and fit in to the wider ecological system more easily and naturalize. But arguably the main step for naturalizing is whether or not that plant can spread. So of course that's reliant upon being able to self-reproduce, either vegetatively or by seed. And of course, depending on how the plant reproduces, by runners, vegetatively, or by seed, that has an impact on how quickly a plant can naturalize and spread.
And it also struck me that it seems to be the most problematic plants are the ones which spread underground. Crocosmia, if anybody's had that in their garden, they know what an absolute nightmare it is to try and get it out of the soil. Yep. Ditto Japanese anemone, which will reproduce from roots. And anything like that, like the Japanese knotweed, anything that can reproduce via runners or bulbs or tubers actually seems to be maybe the most problematic to deal with in terms of removal. I don't know whether that's true or not, but it seems as if it could be.
It could well be true. It's the same. I share the same perception. And those are the sort of traits that could be looked at using that trait-based approach. So looking at a characteristic of a plant and which characteristic increases the probability of it becoming invasive. So when we're looking at plants that spread vegetatively, of course, as you say, they can be very problematic in gardens. If we look at Monbretia again, does spread vegetatively. And in North Wales, I've seen it myself where a gardener, this is going back to raising public awareness of the issue, throwing Monbretia over the fence into a wild patch does not necessarily mean that will compost down. If the conditions are correct, it will probably thrive. And that's perhaps how Monbretia has spread so widely in North Wales. It's false understanding that the plant might just compost down if it's thrown over the fence. But Monbretia is a good example of, because I've seen it myself, of how that doesn't happen. And that's a mode of being introduced into wild. And you could, on that basis, have repeated introductions into the wild using the same practice.
Yeah, that's very true. So obviously gardeners need to be very aware of what they're doing. Is there anything that they can be doing to help with any further research maybe that you're doing or that anybody else is conducting?
Yes, and of course here I will point out that the vast majority of gardeners are responsible gardeners. It's small practices such as this that we need to raise the awareness of. Gardeners are always encouraged to participate or engage with my research, and I try my very best to share it online, doing podcasts such as this or blogs, for example, giving talks. I very much enjoy giving talks to gardening groups because always after giving a talk, I'm given very difficult questions that I might not necessarily be able to answer on the spot, but I very much enjoy then catching up or following up on those questions afterwards. Not only can gardeners engage in research such as this, try and engage with their local gardening groups or even the Royal Horticultural Society, of course, but then there are small steps you can take in the garden. I've used the example of the Monbretia, but if we look at invasive species, it's the choice of plants that we have in the garden. So firstly, looking at, do we need to have an invasive plant in the garden still? or could we look at alternatives? Failing that, if we have an invasive ornamental plant growing in the garden, many of these are beautiful. That's why they've been introduced initially. Small steps such as deadheading the plant before it goes into seed, for example, again reduces the risk associated with that plant. So there are many small steps that gardeners can take.
And just casting a gaze into your crystal ball, do you think the way that we garden will change in the future as a result of threats to our ecosystems? So perhaps maybe we'll have less plants imported, or there will be a smaller range available, or even that we might ban certain species. Do you think we will have to change our gardening practices?
I think undoubtedly we'll have to change, mainly because of climate change. So that could be, if we go back to legislation, I mentioned that the list of plants, invasive plants that fall under legislation, is updated. And that's important to update the list of plants, banned plants, so that it reflects current data and current evidence. And that, of course, means that we might lose a few plants from our choice if they fall under legislation. But, of course, at the very beginning, I mentioned that we had 78,000 different ornamental plants in the British Isles, including all the different varieties and cultivars and so on. So it's not as if we've got a limited choice to experiment with. And in the future, if we're being optimistic, I am a gardener, so there is bias here perhaps, but if we're looking at climate change, it gives us an opportunity to grow plants that have so far been struggling, perhaps because of rising average winter minimum temperatures, for example. We might be able, especially in the south, to be able to experiment with new ornamental plants. Of course, carefully, so that we consider whether they have invasive potential or not. But there's also a positive side to change. And also practices, of course, there are wider implications when it comes to changing gardening practices in the future. That also includes pests and diseases, buying British-grown plants where possible, of course, and also issues such as sustainable water use and so on. There's a huge list of factors that we need to consider when it comes to a changing climate, and of course those will then have an impact on how we garden.
As always, a huge thank you to today's guest, Tomos Jones. You can find the link to Tomos's blog in the show notes. And thank you to you too for listening. And don't forget, if you're enjoying the podcast, please do share it with others who you think might be interested. If you can't support me on Patreon or sling me a few quid on GoFundMe, and I do get it, sometimes the pennies are tight, particularly at the moment, the next best way of helping me out is to share the podcast, along with giving me a review wherever you get your podcasts. And please do go to www.ivyhatchplantsupplies.co.uk to support a UK nursery and to help their business stay up and running during these tough times. Look after yourselves, and I'll catch you all next Tuesday. You can download or listen to the podcast direct from the website www.rootsandall.co.uk, where you'll also find my blog and a sign-up form for the newsletter, which gives you a weekly roundup of content, plus the inside scoop on things like upcoming guests. Or you can subscribe wherever you normally get your podcasts. Email me with comments and feedback at podcast@rootsandall.co.uk. Follow me on Twitter, Roots and All, Facebook, Roots and All UK, and Instagram, Roots and All Pod. But please also check out my Patreon, where you can make a one-off donation or take out a monthly subscription to help support my work, because if you like what I do, please help me to continue doing it. Even if you make a one-off donation of £1, trust me, it all helps, and I will be immensely grateful. So please go to Patreon and search for Roots and All.